بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته, brothers and sisters and friends and everybody else. Welcome to another podcast with my beloved Shaykh Abu Aaliyah. Assalamu alaikum, Shaykh. How are you?
Walaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm good, mashallah, by Allah's grace. And yourself?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So today we're going to be talking about a kind of quasi-controversial topic, which is called ilm ul-kalām. And we're going to have our beloved Shaykh explain what that means. And then the Shaykh is going to explain the difference between blameworthy kalam and praiseworthy kalam. And also, he's going to go into the kind of settled hanbali position concerning this topic. And we're going to be talking about, well, how can we distinguish between praiseworthy kalam and blameworthy kalam? And we'll add a few more things here and there. It's an important topic because especially when we look at the online dawah and even offline dawah space, you see many people using language that is sophisticated, that is philosophical. And sometimes when people have a kind of primary or basic understanding of that particular tradition, meaning using intellectual, sophisticated arguments to defend and share Islam, there's usually two camps. There's the camp that says you cannot use such language because that is ilm ul-kalām and that is blameworthy. And don't you know, big scholars said that you should be kind of flogged and punished for this. And I'll quote Imam Shafi'i, because he's always used, may Allah have mercy on him, as a kind of, a quote and a statement to bash those who try to defend Islam academically and intellectually and share Islam intellectually. And then you got the other camp who basically say, no, just use Qur'an and Sunnah, just use basic language for every audience. And I know that sounds like a straw man, but I'm just doing it deliberately just to get you to understand that there are quasi two camps here, yeah? And just to indicate the second camp, let me give you the quote from Imam Shafi'i. He said, "My ruling regarding the people of theological rhetoric, meaning ilm ul-kalām, is that they should be beaten with palm leaves and shoes and be paraded amongst the king's folk and the tribes, with it being announced, this is the reward of the one who abandons the book and the sunnah and turns to theological rhetoric, in other words, ilm al-kalām." So, given this is the situation, and I've been accused of being someone of innovation and someone who basically follows Ahl al-Kalam, the people of Kalam, and I'm not referring to the Quran and Sunnah and this, that, and the other, which is complete nonsense. But people have that framing because of these quotes from our tradition that are not necessarily misunderstood. So Shaykh is going to explain to us what is ilm al-kalam, what's the difference between praiseworthy and blameworthy, what's the hanbali settled position, how can we distinguish between the two forms of kalam, and we'll maybe entertain some other questions as well. So Shaykh, sorry for giving this hot theological potato to you, but you're the best at juggling hot potatoes. May Allah bless you, Shaykh.
Ameen, mashallah, la quwwata illa billah, alhamdulillah, rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. ربنا لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم أما بعد. Yeah, it is a hot potato. It is something that from the earliest of days, and you read an English translation of a very fierce anti-kalam statement from Imam Shafi'i, and it's not the only anti-kalam statement he has, nor is it the only anti-kalam statement from the great imams and scholars of early Islam, who we affectionately call our Salaf or our Salaf al-Salih, pious predecessors. And that is something indisputable. However, Imam Shafi'i has other sayings about kalam as does, for instance, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, which we will explore later. Along with the questions that you raised, that hopefully we're going to try to delve into and get some general clarity. General clarity because Imam Malik was once asked, and this kind of is an anecdote. I mean, the narration is authentic. It's in Qadi Iyad's Tartib. Imam Malik, someone read the Muwatta to Imam Malik in 40 days. And he said, what took me 40 years to compile, you have read it in 40 days. How little will you understand it? In a similar vein, this topic can be very deep, and it is highly contentious if we take the whole gamut of scholarship from the earliest days up until more contemporary times. And there has been a continued back and forth, and there has never been, and will likely never be until perhaps the Mahdi comes, or some charismatic figure that the Ummah can collectively bind around. But there has never been, and is likely to never be, a unified stance on the role or the place of ilm ul-kalām in Islam, or more specifically in Sunni theology, the theology of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Even if we could point to a normative position that begins to emerge from the 6th and 7th and the 8th Islamic centuries onwards, there has never been, and is unlikely to be, any unanimity on this subject. And I want the audience, the listeners, to understand just the depth of controversy involved. And so any pretensions on my behalf that I'm going to clear this all up for the audience is merely that. It's pretensions, and it's just waham. It's a kind of delusion on my behalf. What I will try to do, though, is in short bursts try to explain the nature of the controversy, why there is a controversy, the two broad positions of the classical scholars in the controversy, and then move it to specifically looking at the hanbali scholars from Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal onwards, and seeing how the attitude towards ilm ul-kalām, which we've yet to define in this video, which I'll define in a minute as a starter, to see the evolving attitude towards ilm ul-kalām within the hanbali Athari school of creed. Okay. After that, I think if I have time, and if you permit me, I would like to also discuss, does ilm ul-kalām have any relevance today? Because even those scholars who believed we can use ilm ul-kalām, and as you said in your introduction, there is, or according to many scholars, I won't say most at the moment, I'm just going to leave it to many just for the discussion. Many scholars talk about a blameworthy ilm ul-kalām, or kalam for short, and a praiseworthy kalam. Even those scholars who believe in a praiseworthy ilm ul-kalām will say that kalam has very restricted uses and can often be a medicine that does more harm than good when applied in the wrong place, to the wrong person, in the wrong proportion or depth. And we will read, if we have time, something from Imam al-Ghazali on that.
Mm.
And he is one of the prime uh, practitioners of ilm ul-kalām or mutakallimun. He's one of the great mutakallim of rational Sunni Islam, to kind of use that very loose term. And yet he has in the Ihya Ulumuddin really some amazing and unexpected things to say. And he says words to the effect that, had you heard this from an anti-kalam scholar, you might not have believed it. So hear it from me, one who has plunged into the deepest depth of ilm ul-kalām, and I'll tell you how little benefit it is, and how it's enough to know just the Sunni creed as it comes from the basic texts of the book and the Sunnah and Ijma theology, and as it comes through the statements of the Imams, who are forced to then put out a creedal statement verbally or in written form because of some of the innovations and deviations that were arising in their time. And that is sufficient for the vast majority of Muslims. So, inshallah, that's what we want to do. The end of this is, do we need to take any position? Perhaps most Muslims don't need to take any position at all. Perhaps most of Muslims, we might find it kind of is beyond them, except that we do live in modernity. And modernity is a highly rational society. And faith, religion with a capital R, is being attacked through rational and discursive discourses, the natural sciences, rationality, things like that. And a lot of the time, to a non-Muslim audience and to a growing Muslim audience from our generation onwards, really from the 60s onwards, that kind of Muslim generation, 1960s onwards, let alone 2026, who, when they don't find Islam being presented in a way that chimes with a science-based, rational outlook, it causes disturbances in the heart. It can sometimes cause apostasy. And therefore, we have a duty to consider that situation, and that situation is a growing one. So I hope those who listen to this will rather, instead of wearing kind of the Arsenal t-shirt, the shirt, or whatever football team we follow, or whatever camp we're in on the ilm ul-kalām issue, know that, you know what, this is Allah's deen. This is speech about Allah that needs to be done with reverent fear. This is trying to understand the scholarly legacy left to us by classical Islam and the Salaf before them, that needs to be tackled reverently and carefully. As regards to gun-ho cowboy gunslinging attitude with one-liners, oh, it's all rubbish, oh, it's all good. This speaks to weak intellect, small piety, and a lack of faith. And that is what you find on social media. You don't find in the language of all these people, normally it's brothers, but there are a few sisters, but normally it's brothers. You don't find the language that reflects reverence of Allah and fear of Allah and a sturdy respect and depth of classical scholarship. What you find is egotistical 20, 30-year-olds, early 40 kids. You're a shab, you're a youth, little picnic youth, right? Until your mid 30s or 40s. That's how the Islamic tradition sees it. And in our case, because we're brought up in a culture that keeps you a teenager well outside of your teen years, okay, we probably don't mature even at mid 30s. We're still probably kids with toys at mid 30s, even early 40s. Had we lived 50 years ago, by mid 30s, early 40s, we would have been mature adults. It's just something that society and socialization imposes on us. And I would like us to be, I'm being a bit frank here, and I would like us to be very, very introspective about this, because reality is most people on social media, they just pick in little things. No one has actually gone through many of these issues thoroughly and from both sides, assuming there are two sides. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. It's not something that I cherish to do. It's not something that that I'm comfortable with actually doing. I've written about this in my forthcoming book, Salafism Reconsidered. There are 2 chapters on ilm ul-kalām, and that's quite forthcoming. Hopefully that book will be maybe with us in a month, well, month and a half, 2 months, inshallah. But there is a companion book to that, Hanbalism, which is unlikely to come out until maybe the end of the year, or perhaps even next year, which also deals with that, but from a more specific hanbali evolutionary creedal development. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq. I will keep it brief in terms of bullet points. My introduction has been long-winded, but I'll keep the issues brief. There'll be more to it. Those who know it can revisit the depth. Those who don't know it will at least get the overall issue. And as the scholars say, man lam yutqin al-usul hurim al-wusul. Whoever doesn't safeguard the foundations will be prevented from the goal. So if we get the overall picture, inshallah, we will benefit from it, even though a lot of this is abstract and it doesn't really have a direct impact on our day-to-day worship, our day-to-day purification of the heart, our day-to-day struggles with keeping away from the haram, and our day-to-day challenges of not being pulled down by modernity or the dunya or the whispers of shaitan. Okay, so with that being said, let's start where you wanted me to start, which is let's just define this term, which is not in the Qur'an itself. The word ilm is in the Qur'an, knowledge. The word kalam is in the Qur'an, speech. But ilm ul-kalām as a term is nowhere to be found in the Qur'an or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sunnah. It's a phrase or a word or a description for a particular science that happens in the early Abbasid times, round about, let's just say, the time of Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, with a particular heterodox sect of Muslims called the Mu'tazilites or the Mu'tazila, who we define as highly rationalists. Rationalists in the sense that they were quite prepared to use rationality and logic as first principles, even if it meant we can reject that particular hadith because it goes against our rational principles. We can maybe even not reject the Quranic verse, but we can put a completely different spin on the Quranic verse that the Prophet ﷺ put on it, or gave the interpretation, or the Sahaba or the Salaf, or the majority of the Salaf, or the consensus of the Salaf. Why? Because it doesn't fit our rational principles. That became a reality in early Islam in round about the second generation of Muslims, and became even worse, such that it reached its violent pinnacle in the time of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, this Mu'tazilite rational theology, trying to impose it upon the Muslim general public and the scholars in particular. It became quite violent in its inquisition by the time of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. And that whole thing was called ilm ul-kalām. Ilm ul-kalām, as a non-scholarly definition, is the science which involves arguing with rational and logical proofs to substantiate a belief or a point of creed. That's what ilm ul-kalām could roughly be translated as at the moment. Whether it's good or bad, it's kind of not the point at the moment. A bit like taqlid. Taqlid means following an authority without knowing the proof. And that could be good or bad, or prescribed or prohibited. The Qur'an speaks about not using the word taqlid, the concept of following qualified authority without knowing the background proofs and reasonings, or following a statement of someone without knowing the proofs and reasonings. And it speaks about it in some verses in a positive way, which is mashru', prescribed. But more often than not, it speaks about the term in a negative way, or the concept in a negative way, where it's mamnu' or prohibited. Ilm ul-kalām is like that. But just as a generic thing, kalam is speech or discourse or argumentation about Allah or God using rational proofs and logic. And it found its way into early Muslim thought in the Abbasid period via Arabic translations of the Greek philosophical legacy of Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and so on and so forth. And the earliest Muslim sect to bring philosophical reasoning or speculative reasoning to bear upon issues of aqidah or creed was the Mu'tazila or the Mutazlites. Their deviancy was what? To give primacy to reason over revelation. That is, to subordinate, to subject the text of the Qur'an and the Sunnah on issues to do with the nature of Allah and His attributes, or predestination, and subject all of the text of the book and the Sunnah to the dictates of rationality and logical discourse. That's what the Mu'tazilite did. Revelation has to be governed by rationality. Rationality sits on top and is the guardian and tells us what we should and shouldn't accept of revelation. Okay, as opposed to the other way around. Okay, that's what we mean by kalam. And the practitioner of kalam was a mutakallim, plural mutakallimun. Okay, and that's something no one will disagree with who knows the historical reality of the development of ilm ul-kalām as it occurs, as it comes down to us in the larger books of creed and aqidah and theology, and has come down to us in the hagiographical biographies of the early scholars and also the early deviants. No one's going to disagree. If someone says, well, I've never heard of this, it's okay. It's not part of the 6 pillars of Islam or the 5 pillars of Islamic practice or spiritual development. One can have taqwa of Allah to the max, so to speak, without knowing any of this. But if we do know it, it's part of intelligent Islam to know that where does human rationality, which is a gift of Allah to us, and it's not like cats have it or dogs have it, or dogs might have it better than cats, but it's something quite uniquely human. And even if we're talking about the AI debate at the moment, okay, AI models, and they're more and more sophisticated models as you know, from ChatGPT onwards, and now we got Claude and whatever else we have in the future. These models don't think like you and I think. These models just take every written and possibly audio piece of data that is out there in the world, okay, but every written thing, and can predict with such speed and high accuracy that if you say Jack and Jill went, it will know that the right thing to say, it went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. And it will do that in milliseconds. And if you say, and Einstein's general theory of relativity is that, it will come out with something very specific about the nature of space-time and how massive objects warp space-time, as opposed to the specific theory of relativity. Why? Not because it's thinking, but it's predicting with such speed and accuracy. For all intents and purposes, it is thinking. But no, the gift of thinking is the gift of Allah to human beings. So how does our rationality fit into our religion? Or do we suspend it entirely? Most Muslims know that no, we don't suspend it entirely. And most of us intuit that it does have a place, even if we don't know where it has a place. That's point one. What is ilm ul-kalām, and how did it start? Okay. Is that okay, Ustad?
Yeah, so two comments and maybe points of clarification, if you don't mind, Sheikh. So the first just point I wanted to raise was Sheikh Jafar Idris, may Allah have mercy on him. He mentioned a very interesting point concerning the aql, the intellect. He said, nowhere in the Qur'an does Allah say the aql is a bad thing. It's actually the opposite. It's actually a good thing. And then there's a kind of sound aql, a sound use of one's rational faculties. So absolutely. The other thing is, so what I gathered was that ilm ul-kalām is basically, its origin story is from the mutazlites, correct?
Yeah, the origin stories with the Mu'tazilites.
Good. But that does not now mean that people from the Athari or Maturidi or Ashari schools of creed that have a kind of sophisticated domain of knowledge called ilm ul-kalām, that they now are mutazlites. It doesn't mean that.
No, it doesn't mean that, and no scholar has no kind of scholar kind of equates the two just like that. Absolutely, they may say there are tendencies, they may say there are similarities, they may say there are overlaps, they may the anti-kalam scholarly camp may find ways of disparaging it, but they know that it's not exactly the same, and they're coming at it from two different points of view,
Yes.
but they might be overlapping. Can I go back to the first point of Sheikh Jafar Rahmatullah Ali? Just one point, and I don't know where he's written this and whatever, but I'm sure he has. But I just want to make this clear. Whenever the Qur'an, when it uses the word aql, on the hanbali, I have two articles about how the word aql is used in the Qur'an. We sometimes translate aql as intellect or rational faculty or rationalization, sometimes logic, but leave logic out there. The word aql in the Qur'an used many times, afala ta'qilun, will you not then use your aql or have aql? Aql actually is from iqal, the word iqal. There's no scholarly dispute about here. And the iqal, if you see the traditional Arab headdress, they've got their shimar, their red and white shimar normally, or white one, comes down like that. And then they have this band, normally a double band, around their head, okay? That band is called an iqal. Once upon a time, it wasn't just a fashionable item of headdress, it had a practical purpose. They would take it off, and it was like a very thick rope, okay, and they would hobble the back legs of a camel to
Mm.
keep it still or to subdue it for whatever reason. And that idea of preventing the camel from bolting by hobbling its legs with an iqal, the reason it's called an iqal, or the Egyptians will say igal, okay, is because the iqal prevents. And the word iqal is related to aql because aql is an aspect of us, is a potential within us, or a capacity within us. The aql is a capacity to prevent us from doing wrong things and from going against God's way.
Mm.
And that's why the Quran and the Sunnah describes the aqil, the one who has aql, or we might translate it as very intelligent person, as the one who actually is in conformity to the dictates of taqwa and piety and obedience to Allah,
Mm.
and will describe as ghayr aqil, as not intelligent or stupid, the one who disobeys Allah and His commands. If we then start taking Quranic terms, aql, and just saying that they are equivalent to the modern term rationality, we'll land ourselves in deep trouble. Even if there is some correspondence between the terms, the actual root of the term, aql, doesn't apply to a rational faculty as much as it does the rational faculty that prevents us from disobeying God. And that's why you will find in the Athar, or the narrations of the Salaf, that's the only way it's used, and it's the only Quranic way it's used.
Yeah, which is very interesting because I like using the word sound rational faculties, meaning that if you use this faculty, the aql, in a sound way,
Legit.
it would lead you to the Quran and the Sunnah. It would lead you to obeying Allah, serving Allah, loving Allah. It would lead you
Indeed.
submitting to God, to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. An interesting point as well, Shaykh, is that in the kind of general quasi-consensus amongst the ulama, which you taught me, the aql is actually a function of the qalb. And sometimes when we talk about the aql in an abstract way, we don't see it holistically because the aql, the intellect, is a function of the qalb, the heart. And the heart can be diseased. It can have kibr. And we've got a podcast on my channel on this, on the major spiritual diseases of the heart. We have kibr, we have ujub, self-amazement, we have hasad, blameworthy jealousy, we have riya, ostentation. And these diseases, if they're infecting the heart, no matter what you feed the aql, it might not function properly because it's within the vessel that if it's not sound, we won't be sound, right? And sometimes we don't see the human being holistically because there's an interplay between the aql itself and the qalb. And sometimes we think everything is a rational issue, but it might just be an issue of kibr. And you should use other tools to lessen the kibr, and maybe the aql will function much better. And that's what people misunderstand, because some people are over focused on the rational issues so much, and they become almost like super rationalists from a postmodern perspective, and they misunderstand the nature of the human being. And what's very interesting, Sheikh, modern cognitive science is telling us that the human being is not purely rational. We may have rational positions that we may think are rational, but they're driven by psycho-emotive forces. And the Islamic tradition has said this for donkey's years, if you like, yeah, that we have this qalb, and if it's diseased, there's kibr or ujub, for example, self-amazement, vanity or aggrandizement, self-aggrandizement, then the issue might not be just an ugly intellectual issue. Stop focusing on it. You need other tools to actually remove or lessen the disease of the heart, then the aql can function properly. Now, I wanted to mention this because in the Dawah discourse, Sheikh, people overemphasize the aql so much as if human beings are just AI machines that you just type in cold and you think you're going to get some kind of result. But the human being is not like that.
So could I come back on 2 points? The first point is, Allah bless you, Ustad, for mentioning that. I had kind of completely forgotten, or I wasn't going to mention anything like that, but it was highly useful. Alhamdulillah, I think you nailed it with that, mashallah, personally. And it's something which really, that has to be one of the takeaway points from this, even though I didn't say it, mashallah. The second point is, just to be a bit pedantic, from what I know and from what I've read and studied, the majoritarian position of Ahl Sunnah, rather than the consensus of Ahl Sunnah, is that, as Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu said authentically, al-aql fil qalb, the intellect resides in the heart.
Mm-hmm.
That is the majoritarian position. The other minority valid opinion, they say al-aql is fi dimagh, the intellect is in the mind. The first majoritarian position says that based upon some Quranic verses and hadiths, and the benefit of it is that you can then immediately see the correspondence between a sound heart and sound thinking, a corrupt heart and a corrupt thinking, and how there is, as you quite rightly said, an interplay. And that's how really, inshallah ta'ala, that is, I hope, the correct view, the majoritarian view. And so, yeah, if we're coming at deen purely rationally, and yet we're sinning, and our eyes are seeing sin, and our tongues are just stumbling into sins every day, even if we're praying and fasting, then our aql is going to be seriously impaired. That doesn't mean our rational faculty will be impaired. I could still be an astrophysicist. I can still be a mathematician. I could still be someone with highly rational, discursive skills, or a philosopher even, okay? But what it would mean is that actually my path to Allah, I put obstacles on my aql and on my qalb, and I've shot myself in the foot. And if a person isn't disturbed by that possibility, then we need to check our iman. May Allah save us.
And also, Shaykh, people understand rationality to mean different things as well. And obviously, this is my field, philosophy. And when people think about rationality, they think about, oh, it's empiricism. It's empirical data and inferences from empirical data. Other people think, oh, it's the scientific domain of knowledge, which is quite similar. Others think, no, it's about metaphysics, first principles that are coherent and they make sense and they allow you to understand the world, including the empirical world. And there are so many debates even on what rational means. And a lot of people, unfortunately, especially in modernity, and even I would say learned people in the Islamic tradition, in a contemporary sense, what they do, they adopt a false notion on what it means to be rational. Like sometimes some people are just like overly empirical,
So,
meaning, yeah.
if you don't mind me, I'm going to cut you here in this time purposely. I feel that given the objectives of this discussion, should we leave that? The reason why is because just at the basic level, intuitively, your average farmer, baker, candlestick maker kind of knows that kind of has an idea of what sound reasoning
Of
could
course.
mean. Whether we're able to soundly reason or not, that's another matter. And
Yeah.
we do that from shopping to marriage to job to religion itself. And so, inshallah, let's just keep it that by aql, Quranically, it's a sound reasoning that restrains us from disobeying Allah and brings us closer to Allah. And that's really what the aql is in the Islamic Quranic sense of the term. But in a more abstract way that we might use it in generalized speech, aql can refer to the rational faculty that every human being kind of generally has, unless they're kind of mad or impaired at that level. And it just means sound reasoning.
Mm.
And so when I'm buying a rubbish car for £10,000 and a really good car for £5,000, kind of, sound reasoning tells me that the second car must be a better buy than the first car, for example, without any skill sets, philosophical and highly cognitive skill sets. We have that, inshallah ta'ala.
The irony,
Uh,
Sheikh,
and
yeah, the irony, Sheikh. So the aql comes from the word to restrain. And what you did, you restrained me very well right now. Which is, it shows your hikmah and your wisdom and your ikhlas, because you knew,
white,
yeah,
white hair in my beard.
yeah, you knew I was gonna go off on one, and you got such good emotional intelligence, and you have the audience in mind for the sake of Allah. You're like, I'm not allowing Hamza to do this right now, and you use the aql in a literal way to actually restrain my abstract aql. May Allah bless you.
Allah bless you. Allah bless you for your kindness. Allah bless you for your kind words. Okay, so that's point one. The meaning of ilm ul-kalām, where it started from, its origins, and what we mean by the discussion. Could I move on to the second point, which is again an indisputable point?
Mhm.
Point two. What was the reaction of the early Imams of Islam from the early ages, the second generation onwards, to this ilm ul-kalām science? Because it showed itself in the heartland of the Islamic capital, Baghdad, okay, early on, and just spread outwards, okay. We have, as was said in this introduction, we have the fiercest statements from the early Imams who religion is taken from, and who are exemplars of the utmost piety and God-fearingness. Okay, and I would like to just read a small sample, which are absolutely reflective and indicative of the stance of the Mu'tazilites, that we will use rationality to define what is right and wrong in the Qur'an and the Sunnah, even at the expense of dispensing clear, authentic statements of the Prophet or hadiths, because it doesn't fit our rational prepositions or principles. That attitude, okay, was fiercely denounced. So, ما أحد ارتدى بالكلام فأفلح. No one engages in kalam and prospers, Imam Shafi'i said. We've already had the other one from you, that well-known authentic statement from Imam Shafi'i. Abu Hanifa's main student, who was an Imam and Mujtahid in himself, Imam Abu Yusuf rahmatullah alayhi, says, Man talaba al-ilma bil-kalam tazandaqa. Whoever seeks knowledge by way of kalam becomes a zindiq, a heretic. As for Imam Ahmad's words, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, La yuflihu sahibul kalam abada. The practitioner of kalam will never prosper. Nor do you, and it continues, nor do you ever see anyone looking into kalam except that in his heart is corruption. And there are statements after statements after statements from the great Imams of early Islam denouncing this kalam, and it was the only type of kalam that was out there. The kalam that we that was associated with the Mu'tazilites, and we still historically associate it with them.
Mm.
I don't want to go into any more words of the Salaf, because it will be pretty fruitless, except to say this small volley of quotes that you've just heard is spot on indicative of 90% of their anti-kalam words. I say 90% or 95% because Imam al-Shafi'i, as an instance, and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, as an example, have pro-kalam words, but their pro-kalam words are not endorsements of the mutazlite kalam, but what might be called a proto-Sunni kalam, or what would become the standard Sunni kalam. And that will be the next point, that scholars differed about those anti-kalam statements. Point 3. Point 1, what do we mean by ilm ul-kalām, or kalam for short? Point 2, the attitude of the early scholars on the ilm ul-kalām that was associated primarily with the Mu'tazilites, putting reason over and above revelation and subjecting revelation to the dictates of reason. Point 3, here is where the debate begins. One group of classical scholars, not hanbalis, not just hanbalis, across the board, one group of classical scholars said those denouncements, those fierce denouncements by the Salaf, they are not only so well known, it establishes irrefutably that kalam, using rationality in matters of theology, when the book and the sunnah should suffice, when the Qur'an and the hadith should suffice, is misguidance. And groups of imams were very strong on this. And they said that is the only way of reading the words of the early imams or salaf with respect to ilm ul-kalām. It's always anti-kalam. However, justice demands, and it does pain me, that those who are able to look into this issue from first principles and original sources, why this point that I'm going to mention now is so often brushed under the carpet, which is that even early scholars recognize that some of these imams of the Salaf, in particular Imam al-Shafi'i, and through a lot of discussion, inter-hanbali discussion between the great imams of the school and the theology, the hanbalis themselves point to pro-kalam statements. So let me do, as part of point 3, divided it into 2. The anti-kalam statements of the imams, and there is no disagreement that there are anti-kalam statements, and they are fierce, some of which we've heard just now. But B, or point 2, or the second part of the third point, is that there are pro-kalam statements. Okay, so I'm going to read one pro-kalam statement from Imam Shafi, and I'll read Imam Ahmad's pro-kalam statement a bit later. But that there was a pro-kalam statement, I'm going to use another statement of Imam Ahmad to show that there is a pro-kalam in his time, and he recognized there is, but he disagreed with it even at that time. Later on, we will see what happens. Imam Shafi, pro-kalam, I'll leave the Arabic. Any person or every person of kalam upon كل متكلم على كتابي والسنة فهو الحق الذي يجب وكل متكلم على غير أصل كتاب ولا سنة فهو هذيان. Any or every person upon the Qur'an and the Sunnah is at the limits that must be. Each one upon a basis other than the book of the Sunnah is delirious or demented. Imam al-Bayhaqi says in these reports, and he brings more than one of he brings not just this one, he brings others from Imam Shafi, and the Shafis are well very clear upon the various statements of Imam Shafi on this subject, and it's not just the one that you mentioned at the beginning. Imam Bayhaqi says in these reports is a proof that what is detested of kalam is that which is not rooted in the book of the Sunnah. And Bayhaqi also says in this is an indication that it is undesirable, according to those of our Imams who stipulated it, to argue using kalam for reasons we have presented. It is also because this reprehensible type of kalam is that of the innovators who oppose the book and the Sunnah. But as for the kalam which agrees with the book and the Sunnah and is clarified rationally and wisely, then such kalam is praiseworthy and desirable if called for. Ash-Shafi'i used it, as did others from our Imams, may Allah be pleased with them, when it was needed, as we already mentioned. So Al-Bayhaqi then prompts us to the fourth point, that very early on, from the likes of Imam Ash-Shafi'i, there was a kalam that was considered blameworthy, where rationality subjugates revelation. And there was a kalam that was considered praiseworthy, which according to Ash-Shafi is a type of rationality that that upholds revelation, that gives it further embellishment and strength, and furnishes the creed that is in the text of the revelation with supportive rational proofs. These rational proofs are not discoverers of truths, they are supporters of existing revealed truths. I'll say that one more time. The praiseworthy kalam is not rationality discovering truths that is outside of revelation. It is rationality supporting truths that already revealed in the book and the Sunnah. Okay. Imam Ahmad, even at in his early time, he has a statement which I wonder if I can find. Let me just, yeah, do not sit with the people of Kalam, even if they defend the Sunnah. So we have a statement from Imam Ahmad, we have a statement from Imam Shafi'i, or we have statements that he's dividing Kalam into two broad camps, praiseworthy and blameworthy, depending upon what reason and rationality does vis-a-vis revelation. If it subdues it, blameworthy. If it endorses it and follows on from it, praiseworthy. Imam Ahmad is telling us historically, even at his time, there were scholars who were doing praiseworthy kalam or kalam to defend the Sunnah, but Imam Ahmad, at least in this saying of his, he doesn't accept even that. Do not sit with the people of kalam, and meaning boycott them, even if they are defending the Sunnah. Okay, so that's point 4. There is actually in early Islam a development of praiseworthy and blameworthy kalam, which Imam Shafi supports, and that is kind of indisputable. According to those early and later scholars who have spent the best part of their lives examining the aqwal, the statements, and the intended meanings of Imam Shafi in all matters of fiqh and religion, including theology and rational theology, like al-Bayhaqi, for example, let alone the whole of the Shafi'i theological school, theologian, they are clear that Shafi'i divides ilm ul-kalām into good and bad. Okay, and that became the dominant view as generations went on. At that point, Ustav, we need to stop and pause and understand historical facts that are indisputable. One, what ilm ul-kalām meant in its original form vis-a-vis the Mu'tazilites. Two, the anti-kalam words of the early Imams or the Salaf, which were very fierce against the Mu'tazilite kalam. 3, that there are one or two or a few pro-kalam statements from these same imams of the Salaf that gives us the idea of 4, that there can be a good and bad kalam, or kalam madhmoom, blameworthy, kalam mamduh, praiseworthy kalam. But what we also have here, and that will bring us on to another point, is that Imam Ahmad seems to be disagreeing or rejecting even the praiseworthy type of kalam, which is there to defend the sunnah, not to subjugate the sunnah. Academic integrity surely must demand from us that we accept that there are these historical facts. Whatever position we take, we can't take a position by denying historical facts. We can make a mistake and deny historical facts, but we can't knowingly say, well, I won't include how to square those circles. We have good opinion that those are the imams who were anti-kalam, lock, stock and barrel, either understood these pro-kalam statements in a different way or didn't believe they were authentic or gave them a different spin. What we don't believe about those people is that they believe that these are authentic and it's kind of clear and it's settled, but I'm going to have my view. And I'm going to pretend that it doesn't have, it's not there, because then that's not scholarship. And we don't believe our imams of that caliber were people of desire and whims. We believe that they make mistakes. We believe they can have good days and bad days, but we don't even believe an average half good taqwa Muslim will purposely do things knowledge-wise against revelation. What about people whose piety is testified to by the ummah in general? Okay, and such that it could be said, just like in the Sahih Hadith, wajabat, it is obligatory, or it is done, meaning that they will be people of paradise. Because, as the Prophet said in one hadith, you are a witness over the ummah. Certain parts of the ummah are a witness for the other parts. Okay, so I just in case someone's confused, the Prophet was with some companions. They're walking in Medina and whatever, and they saw this person, and they came across a funeral, and someone had just died, and the people around that funeral, they were saying some really bad things about him, and it was like they were just relieved that this man is not in their lives anymore. He's dead, and they were saying some really nasty things about him, not nasty as in whims, but just how he was. He was bad, and that this type of badness is normally punished in the hereafter. And the Prophet said, wajabat, and he walked on. And then they came to another funeral, and the people were praising the person who died, and said that this is a type of deeds and life that that Allah grants paradise to. And the Prophet said, wajabat. Upon that, the companions asked, back there you said wajabat, it is obligatory, it is so. And now you're saying wajabat. What's that about? And he said, well, as for the first man, that set of Muslims testify to his reality, and it will be so in the hereafter, hellfire. And the second janaza, those set of Muslims testified to his reality, and so it will be so wajabat. I don't want to say it's obligatory because nothing obliges Allah in that sense. And then he said, you are a witness to the people. I mean, it's a Quranic verse as well. And the ummah has witnessed the part of the ummah that is significant in this, not the lalupanju lot like us. Right? The old Urdu phrase that my late dad used to use, lalupanju, not the riffraff of the ummah. We have no saying this, but the part of the ummah that is worthy of being taken into consideration have all witnessed the imamate, the imamship of these early imams, such that we can say wajabat.
So, Shaykh,
Okay.
let's start to zoom in maybe on Imam Ahmad's position and the settled hanbali position concerning praiseworthy and blameworthy ilm ul-kalām. And then after that, let's quickly discuss maybe general principles on, well, what are the criteria for praiseworthy kalam and blameworthy kalam? And then we could end it on my my kind of position on Western philosophy, and then we'll take it from there. Oh, and we'll end it on also al-Ghazali's statement on using
Usefulness on.
as a medicine. And that for me shows the depth of Imam al-Ghazali, may Allah have mercy on him, when he saw dawah as a contextual thing. Like some people who are emotional, spiritual, you're not going to give them abstract, rational proofs, right? Because you may lose them, or you may basically, you know, get them to run away from the deen. But if you use what they need based on their social, intellectual context, psychological context, then you can awaken their fitrah. And this is one of the damaging things about today's Dawah discourse, is everyone uses just one way, and they don't understand the human being as the individual human being. And I follow the principle that the sunnah of Dawah for individuals is to individualize them. So know their context, and that's missing sometimes. But anyway, so Shaykh, let's go into Imam Ahmad's statement, the hanbali settled position on praiseworthy and blameworthy kalam. Then let's talk about, well, what are the general criteria for blameworthy and praiseworthy kalam, and then we're going to al-Ghazali's statement. Then you could look at my insights concerning Western philosophy, inshallah.
Okay, so the difficulty that possibly could be here with Imam Ahmad and the Hanbalis is that today what we have is people playing fast and loose with Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal and the Hanbali tradition of fiqh and theology. And I don't believe it's happening intentionally, it's just happening, playing fast and loose. And what do I mean by that? Let's just say, for argument's sake here, Imam Ahmad during his lifetime was always asked questions. And many of his senior students, wrote down books, small books and booklets, and sometimes quite thick, 2 volumes, 3 volumes, sometimes just a small, slim pages of questions that we asked Imam Ahmad. And so there is, in the Hanbali tradition or Hanbali legacy, scholastic classical legacy, a genre of writing called al-masail, the questions that individual scholars and leading students of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal asked Imam Ahmad. Most of them are fiqh related, but there are quite a few which are theological. Okay. Say 150 years after Imam Ahmad, or 100 years after, all of those masail, 30, 40, 50, 60 different authors authoring their own masail that they asked Imam Ahmad these questions during his lifetime, and this is how he responded. Okay, and normally the response is yes, no, yes, it's good, no, no, it's not, haram, dislike, whatever. Sometimes it's a line. Very seldom is it a paragraph or more. That's how short some of these responses are. Sometimes a question could be long with a brief answer. Within 100 odd years after, all of these masail were meticulously collected by one of the great Hanbali scholars that was a student of the main students of Imam Ahmad. And he collected it in 40 odd volumes back then. Once that 40 odd volume was done of all the masail, this Jami ul-Masail, a little after, one of the scholars, a number of scholars, was sifting through it for fiqh issues, and the first hanbali text was culled from these masails in a form, in a textual form that resembled how the Hanafis and the Shafis and the Malikis have written their fiqh books, the texts of their fiqh books, starting with Tahar and Salat and so on and so forth. And that all got extracted and then textualized in book form from these Masail collection. Commentaries came from them, and so on and so forth. Likewise in Aqidah, in creed, in beliefs, the information, the responses of Imam Ahmad were drawn and culled from there, and statements were taken. And from there, the whole scholastic legacy of texts and their commentaries, and this statement of Imam Ahmad is cancelled by this statement, or is explained by this statement, or is given further context by this statement. That all happens in the scholastic legacy. So I'm just going to mention fiqh of how it's done in the relied upon position of the school. This is not my understanding. This is just Imam al-Mardawi, who begins to be the origin of the later school in its final crystallized form. And whether it's the Imam Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, the Salafi Shaykh, rahmatullah alayh, or whether it's more traditional Hanbalis, okay, and whether it's before them, before even Salafism or Wahhabism in the modern form existed, everyone agreed that these are the relied upon books, and it starts with al-Mardawi. Mardawi just says, and I'm really summarizing it, but it's quoted verbatim in the Hanbalism as creed theology, creed theology and spirituality, which is, as I said, a book that is a companion book to my Salafism one, but is not due out until maybe 5-6 months later, maybe, inshallah. But otherwise, I already did it back in 2023, completed it. He says that this is how we do fiqh. We look at all the statements of Imam Ahmad, and if Ibn Qudama and Majd, the grandfather of Ibn Taymiyyah, agree upon a particular position from the words of Imam Ahmad, that becomes the authoritative position of the school. If Majd ibn Taymiyyah, grandfather of Ibn Taymiyyah, the great Hanbali jurist, and if Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi agree upon a position, that is the authoritative or mu'tamad position of the Hanbali school. It is what fatwa is given with. If Majd and Ibn Qudama differ, then that becomes a bit problematic. Then we look to Ibn Rajab and Ibn Taymiyyah, the famous Ibn Taymiyyah, the grandson of Majd. And if Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Rajab agree with either Majd or Ibn Qudama in their difference, that becomes the school, because they are considered to be the third and fourth greatest authority in knowing Imam Ahmad and the Hanbali fiqh of the classical Hanbali scholars. And then there is Ibn Mufli, who comes fifth. Okay, and Ibn Mufli, if he says this, then, but the point being is, it's a matter of looking at all the data from Imam Ahmad, the various responses and opinions, and who has the greatest and best understanding. Who knows Imam Ahmad in context of what the book and the Sunnah say best of all? And it said these are the people: Majd, Ibn Qudama, Ibn Rajab, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Mufli, rahimahumullah ajma'in. And roughly that's how it's done. So for me now to go and come across Masail, which are published in modern print, okay, not 40 volumes, but separate, and say, oh, Imam Ahmad said this, Imam Ahmad said that, I'm basically just cherry picking, and I haven't gone through the ijtihadat, nor the understanding, nor the contextualization, nor the shamil, the comprehensive, taken into consideration the various other masail. And that's what you see on social media. And that's what you see, this in this revival, of so-called, I'm not going to be Salafi, I'm going to be Athari, but actually you're not Athari. You're not hanbali Athari at all. All you're doing is putting a modern spin on it, or you're following a Shaykh that is putting a modern spin on it. Okay, because it's a question of authority. All right. Here is al-Mardawi, here is al-Bahuti, here is whoever, okay, of the great ones, okay, and here is the mu'tamad authoritative statements, and then you're going to come along and say, well, no, I don't think so. Really? With what God-fearing knowledge? So let's go to Hanbalism's evolution of ilm ul-kalām. In the beginning, because Imam Ahmad's statements, or there's so many of Imam Ahmad's statements, the vast majority of them were so clear of being anti-kalam, and his life was a paragon of anti-kalamness in his inquisition, in his 18 months inquisition, being flogged and so on and so forth, 24 months inquisition. That became a very dominant opinion from his students and the students of his students and the students of his students of his students, so much so that Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, the one that we fiqh is, he's one of the two pillars of the school, was absolutely clear. Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi on ilm ul-kalām. So he's a 7th century scholar, okay, 6th, 7th century scholar. He's talking about the mutakallimun, the people of kalam, practitioners of kalam, and he's not making a distinction between blameworthy and praiseworthy, just across the blanket, because he takes the view, look at all these statements from Imam Ahmad, and then you have one or two that go against it. Well, that seems unusual. Are they really sound? Whatever. He even has one, don't sit with the people of kalam even if they're defending the sunnah. How more clear can you get? Okay, so he says to speak of them, the mutakallimun, the practitioners of kalam, is only to censure them, to warn against them, to cause people to flee from associating with them, to command boycotting or shunning them, and abandon looking into their books. End of. And that's basically his thing, and that it's likely to be the dominant view of the early Hanbalis up until the 6th, 7th Islamic century, including the time of Ibn Qudama. I say dominant because you can find major imams of the Hanbalis, particularly Qadi Abu Ya'la and others, and a few others rather, having good kalam, bad kalam outlook. And even at the time of Ibn Qudama, Ibn Hamdan al-Hanbali, the great Usuli Hanbali scholar, is very clear in his book on the etiquettes of a mufti and the one who asked the mufti, the mustafti, okay, and in his book on usul al-fiqh, that ilm ul-kalām, he says, وعلم الكلام المذموم هو أصول الدين إذا تكلم فيه بالمعقول المحض. The science of blameworthy kalam is when the articles of faith are spoken about using only reason أو مخالف للمنقول, or contravenes clear-cut textual proofs. مخالف للمنقول السريع, clear-cut textual proofs. فإن تكلم فيه بالنقل فقط, but if it is spoken about using textual proofs alone, أو بالنقل والعقل الموافق له, or by textual proofs accompanied by reason which supports them, فهو أصول الدين, then it is the true أصول الدين وطريقة أهل السنة وأهلها, and the path of Ahl Sunnah and its followers. So we, at the same time as Ibn Qudama, you have one of the great Hanbali legalists and theoreticians, Ibn Hamdan, okay, whose book on Adab al-Mufti and his book on Usul al-Fiqh is still kind of used as one, a major primer, having a nuanced ilm ul-kalām stance. But Ibn Qudama, the great pillar of the school, has an anti. I can't go into a lot, but it is on my website, and it is in the Salafism Reconsidered book that hopefully will be out in hopefully by 2 months, inshallah ta'ala. That's the hope. It shows you how Ibn Taymiyyah lays down some foundations that could there be a possible reconciliation? And 50 years or 100 years after, the school takes that Taymiyyan hope of could there be some type of reconciliation, even if it's not a full reconciliation, between the Sunni practitioners of Kalam and the anti-practitioners of Kalam. And that project then seems to be taken very seriously by the Mardawi and the Mu'tamad authoritative Hanbali position onwards, such that by the 9th century, it is the normative position of the Hanbalis. It's no good saying, oh, but Ibn Qudama says, and he said Zindiq to them, and he said this, and he said that, because that's when the school is in flux. Now, according to the authoritative position, no one really takes that position as the authoritative position of the school. An individual humbly might take the non-authoritative valid position, but it's not the authoritative. And how do they come by that? Ibn Muflih. So something to know about Ibn Muflih. Ibn Taymiyyah, it is said, Ibn Taymiyyah, out of all his students, they say, it is said that Ibn Abdul Hadi was the greatest and who was the student who had the greatest knowledge of hadith from amongst Ibn Taymiyyah's students. Ibn al-Qayyim had the greatest knowledge of usul and theology and Arabic language amongst his students. And Ibn Muflih was the greatest in knowledge of the Hanbali school and Hanbali fiqh amongst the students of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn al-Qayyim testifies to Ibn Muflih's knowledge of Hanbali fiqh, and he's unparalleled in his time. Okay, these three students, okay, reflect the kind of the prism of the Taymiyyan knowledge. Okay, Ibn Muflih in one of his books, okay, he over 20 odd pages, he starts with anti-kalam statements, and he quotes other Hanbali scholars who followed in the anti-kalam and whatever, all the way up to Ibn Qudama and others. Then he says, however, there is a pro-kalam faction of the Hanbalis, classically and in our time. And they say and he said the pro-kalam statement is because Imam Ahmad said, we used to order silence. Meaning, look, don't get into kalam. Don't use rational proofs. Just state it as the book and the sunnah says, then move on. The book and the sunnah says, and we move on. You want to argue, you're standing in front of the wrong person. We just say our piece, we're yamshi, and then we move on. Okay. We used to order silence, but when we were called to the affair, it was upon us to defend it and clarify of the affair what refutes what they said. We used to order silence. We used to tell people, don't even do Sunni kalam. Just keep it book and the sunnah. That's enough. That's what revelation came with. That's the revelation. That's what the Prophet gave us. Why are you being unsatisfied with what the Prophet gave us? But when we were called to the affair, what affair? The issue of the Mutazlite saying the Qur'an is created, and all their rational arguments to justify their false heresy. Their heresy, all heresy is false. He said, but when we were called to the affair, it was upon us to defend it and clarify of the affair what refuted what they said. So he wrote Rad al-Zanadiq or Rad al-Jahmiyyah, a book which has rational proofs refuting the Mu'tazilite claim that the Qur'an is created, rather than saying the Qur'an is the word of Allah uncreated. And it's there. You can still see an Arabic copy. There is an old English translation of it, a scholarly translation, I think done back in the 70s or even earlier than that perhaps. And it's just rational proofs after stating, often from the Qur'an, but sometimes from Imam Ahmad's own kind of reasoning. And so Qadi Abu Ya'la and Ibn Abi Ya'la and al-Buhuti and al-Mardawi and the rest of the kind of later Hanabila from whom fiqh and fatwa and aqidah is taken, said actually that is the end position of Imam Ahmad. And then all they do is they disagree. Does this last statement that was towards the end of Imam Ahmad's life abrogate all of the earlier statements? That's one opinion. But scholars in general don't like abrogation if they can avoid it, because it's like getting rid of all of those other texts. Al-Buhuti, and he speaks for the majority of the hanbali jurists and theologians, says actually it's not abrogation. These final words of Imam Ahmad don't abrogate, they just harmonize. When there is no need for ilm ul-kalām, we don't do ilm ul-kalām, we just do the text of the book and the sunnah. Or those little tracts like Aqidat Tahawiyya or Ibn Qudama's Lumat al-I'tiqad that are just expressed in basic Quranic and Hadithic terms, even if it's using their own words. And they're not shored up with arguments, rational arguments. But when there is a need, we use rational arguments. That's how Buhuti and the relied upon authorities Hanbalis take it. It can be used when there is a need. There is no need to use it when there is not a need. You're just making things unnecessarily worse. And that is exactly what al-Ghazali said back in the 5th century, 300 years before or 400 years before. But he expressed it so beautifully. So Al-Buhuti just says, the statement of Ibn Hamdan is like a harmonization between the two views, and this is preferable over abrogation. So for someone to say, oh, the Hanbali say this, quoting Ibn Qudama, no. It's a bit like saying the Hanbali say this because Ibn Qudama says, oh, actually a traveler, he can, as long as he's traveling, he can combine his prayers. That's not the school. That's Ibn Qudama's personal opinion. The school is, it's for 4 days or 20 prayers. If you're intended to travel and stay for more than 20 prayers, then you're a resident as soon as you arrive at your destination. Okay. What I'm trying to say is there is an anarchy that has become more than normalized of just picking quotes from the Salaf or from Imam Ahmad and whatever. And that is the new anarchy that has been foisted upon the Ummah for more than 100 years, but definitely for the last 30, 40, 50 years. And the internet and social media has made that worse. And it's not laughable, it's punishable. And people who speak about Allah's deen without knowledge are under the curse of Allah and the angels, or the curse of Allah.
Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. So just to be
Because
clear,
no one has any right to speak about these things without thorough authorization and rights.
sure. May Allah bless you, Shaykh. So just to be clear, so the more latest statement of Imam Ahmad, may Allah have mercy on him, it's not seen as an abrogation per se, but it's seen as a kind of caveat. And that caveat is that you use kalam when needed and if needed, and you use it in the right way, but it's still within the understanding of the distinction between
So
praiseworthy kalam and blameworthy kalam. Yeah.
absolutely
So
spot on.
yeah, and that would
And
reflect.
that is the position of the great masters that are the mutaakhirun, the later Hanbalis, from which fatwa and fiqh and the authoritative manuals of fiqh and aqidah are taken today in an unbroken chain.
Yeah, so that's why, you know, Ibn Hamdan's statement is quite a good statement when he makes a distinction between the blameworthy kalam and the praiseworthy kalam. And the praiseworthy kalam is when you're using, when the articles of iman or usuluddin are spoken, of using, it's upholding the articles of iman and the textual proofs using reason. Okay, so now this leads to some final questions, which is, well, what are the kind of, I know this is another podcast in of itself, but let's try and shorten this. How do we make a distinction, or what are the criteria between understanding praiseworthy kalam and blameworthy kalam? Now, usually when I speak to people like in a coffee shop setting, I say things like, well, it's the kind of rational evidences that can be are supporting based on or cannot or do not contradict the textual evidence. Now, that in of itself is a massive debate as well, for sure. Now, obviously, that was just a coffee shop discussion. Fix it for me. So, what is the kind of what criteria do we use to make a distinction between the praiseworthy and blameworthy kalam? Now, if it's too much to answer, then we could just pause it and just park it for another time. But what are your thoughts on that question?
So it's not that it's too much to answer, and nor is it right for me to have thoughts when the scholars are already clear about this. Okay. In the definition of blameworthy and praiseworthy kalam, there is the distinction. Those rational proofs which support what is already established in the book and the sunnah, okay, then that becomes praiseworthy rationalization of the texts. But a rationalization that goes against an established creedal point that is clear in the book or clear in the sunnah or has an ijma, a scholarly consensus about it, any rationalization which contradicts that is false kalam or blameworthy kalam. Okay, it's the kalam like of the mutazlites. This is no scholar who defines kalam in good and bad ways will differ with this. That's so if through my rationalizations I either negate or distort a creedal point, an axiomatic, well-established point of belief, aqidah, creed, through my rationalizations, then I've done blameworthy kalam and I'm censured and I'm sinful. But if I've done it in a way that upholds the axiomatic creedal point that is established in Sunni orthodoxy, then I'm not using blameworthy kalam. It may be that what I am saying and the language I'm using and some of the terms I'm using might be wrong, might be slightly skewed, but the intended goal is not wrong. Okay, I might start talking about the existence of God in a way that maybe I'm not taking into consideration the deeper nuances of Islamic theology, and so I might be using words in Arabic or in English that is meaning to do well and establish what the Qur'an itself is generally telling us, that all existent things need a creator for their existence, and that creator has to be eternal. Okay, and that's really what the Quran is telling the Bedouins and everything, like everybody else like that, and it does it in very fitri type of instinctive type of ways that everybody gets, because at that level that is just reasonable rationality that every human being can have, and they don't have to be, astrophysicists or theoretical physicists. But that is blameworthy and praiseworthy kalam. But I think our concern should not be so much that the dawah within general Sunni orthodoxy is rationalizing to contradict the book and the sunnah and the ijma. That is happening with a few individuals and has always happened with a few individuals. The 19th and the 20th century modernist Muslim movement started doing that, and it still has effects and leftovers even today. But on the whole, the dawah is clear that this is the creed that we need to support, the generic Sunni creed or the Sunni creed. But they might be doing it in ways that actually, if you the lazim of it, the natural consequence of it might be that actually there's some little errors there. Inshallah, forgiven errors, because we're trying to aim for the right thing. Which is what. So that's point one. Point two of this is even the pro scholars agree that and Imam Ghazali has a tract on this, a specific book on this, okay, on not imposing ilm ul-kalām upon the masses. Every scholar agrees, pro-kalam or anti-kalam, all the masses need, depending upon where they live and their reasonable level, their level of knowledge or gaining knowledge, and how reasonable it is for them to understand abstract points or points of theology and whatever, because everyone varies and we're each according to our capacity. And the Bedouin over there who hardly mixes with civilization and books and has just their life of austere life is very different than an artisan in the heart of the Islamic Caliphate, and very literate and very cultured and very in contact with scholars. One has an obligation more than the other in terms of what they should be knowing or what they should, and what they can't know reasonably. The Ummah needs to just be invited to a generic Sunni Islam. Abu Bakr and Umar are the best. The Sahaba are all praiseworthy and udul, upright, because our du'as are seeking refuge in the punishment of the grave. Punishment of the grave is haqq, for example. Things like that. Okay, believers will see Allah in the hereafter. Things like that. And before that, iman and kufr. Okay, the distinction between iman and kufr. Okay, whatever. Those things need to be given priority over. And this is the beauty of ilm ul-kalām. The relevance of ilm ul-kalām, leaving alone how not much. Ilm ul-kalām has kind of set this out. There is foundational aqidah, which is the dividing line between faith and disbelief. There is orthodox aqidah, dividing line between Islamic orthodoxy and Islamic misguidance or heterodoxy. And there is personal aqidah, that whether you take this view or that view, it doesn't harm your orthodoxy, let alone your iman. The example of the first is to say, to doubt or to say that there is another prophet after the Prophet ﷺ. It's the dividing line between faith and disbelief. Okay, it has to be clear. The Prophet ﷺ is the final prophet. And when Jesus comes down, alayhi salam, he comes as a follower of the Prophet ﷺ, not as an independent new prophet. Example of orthodoxy is, as I said, punishment of the grave. Believing in those hadiths that speak about punishment of the grave and how we should be seeking refuge in it, because the punishment of the grave happens after death. In between dying and being resurrected in the hereafter, there is grave and its punishments. And that is well established through the hadiths. Okay, so much so that there is a consensus and ijma of the Muslim scholars, and those who disagree are either misguided Muslims or outside the fold of Islam, dependent upon how they rejected it. That is orthodox belief. So let's just stick with this. They are misguided Muslims. Okay, let's just stick with that position. They're misguided Muslims. And the third example of personal aqidah, the Prophet ﷺ made Isra and Mi'raj. That is an absolute foundational belief to believe. Okay, rejecting it takes you outside of Islam or takes you outside of Sunni orthodoxy, depending upon what part you're rejecting. But did the Prophet ﷺ see Allah with the eyes of his head or the eyes of his heart on the night of the ascension? Is a legitimate difference of opinion. Whatever opinion you take, it doesn't harm your orthodoxy, let alone your iman. If we can just get that about aqidah, the ummah would be so much better off for it, and there'll be less schisms and intra-creedal wars between Muslims. That's one of the benefits of the rationalization of ilm ul-kalām rationalization. It taught us how to do that well. Very clear. So the generic, the masses just need a generic creed. The masses, ideally though, even if it's generic, ideally, if they could, over a period of a year in their local mosque or in small study circles under the guidance of a scholar, just go through basic texts like Aqidah Tahawiyah, let's say 100 points, 100 one-liner sentences that really don't take great knowledge or intellectualization to get. Okay, we believe this, we believe this, we believe this, we believe in the two angels on the shoulder, we believe in the punishment of the grave, we believe that Jesus alayhi salam will return, we believe in the Dajjal, we believe in the Qadr, we believe in the pen. Over a year, if they could do this, or the lu'mat al-i'tiqad, okay, although the Tahawiyah seems to have has a greater acceptance across the ummah throughout the ages in a way that lu'mat al-i'tiqad doesn't have and is associated with hanbali theology specifically. then that's brilliant. That is the ideal situation. Otherwise, the lay people increase their iman not through further aqidah issues, unless they have a doubt, then they need to get that sorted out straight away by a competent scholar, and not competent in he knows the word, he knows the stuff, but he can articulate it. Too many of our sheikhs and some of our scholars, whether in Arabic or in English, are very poor at articulating to the contemporary audience what should be articulated. It's not that they don't know their stuff or they're not scholarly. They don't know how to articulate to the audience. Sometimes, especially in the English, it is cringeworthy to the max. Don't teach if you can't articulate, especially theology. Teach spirituality because you can use fluffy words in spirituality in ilm ul-kalām. Teach real general Islam because you can still use fluffy words. Okay, go and write a fluffy book, and and you'll become a bestseller for sure. Right? Okay, but if you're going to do theology, okay, if you're going to do theology, or even if you're going to do fiqh to some degree, but more so theology, make sure your words are explicitly clear and precise, that you have the nuances, you understand the nuances in the Arabic, and that you can translate them and give a give a corollary in the English language that this is what is being meant here. If you don't have that, don't get into it. You have no right to do this. None of us have a right to teach. We only get permission to teach. Everyone has a right to invite to the basics of Tawheed and the pillars and of Islamic practice and belief. Everyone has a right. No one has a right to teach details unless they are given an idhn, a permission. Otherwise, you're innovating and you've deviated from the beginning. And whoever's beginning is bad, likely his ending will be bad. May Allah save us.
I mean.
So it's a hikam of Allah.
So, Shaykh, final 2 points. Jazakallah for that.
You say to all those brothers out there, some of whom I know, many of whom I don't know, fear Allah, because most of you are real messing up. You don't have enough knowledge, you don't have enough articulation, and you come across as not having the reverent fear of Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, but Allah knows best what's in the heart.
Yeah, I mean, today it's like the famous Latin phrase, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. And I've seen that a lot. And unfortunately, when people have great articulation, they come across as intellectual and they come across as kind of coherent. And people...
That's because in the land of the blind, because I actually think many brothers who come across as articulate aren't very articulate, because the articulation is not necessarily using technical terms, but it's just using language that suits the science of what's being discussed and the person who is the receiver of it.
Yeah, my point was that because of this age where everyone has a platform now, and sometimes there are voices that are lacking, and when people have their own platform, they basically articulate themselves in a particular way that sounds rational, sounds smart, sounds coherent, sounds intuitive, but that person may not have the correct framework. They may not be considering other important first principles and evidences of the deen, but yet they're articulating it to a particular audience, and that audience, they're like blind, and this one-eyed king is leading them astray. And it's unfortunately happening in today's age, and that's one of the destructive forces of liberal modernity, that everyone could say whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want. Yeah, and whenever they want. And that's one of the damaging aspects.
More or less, that's why Ibn al-Mubarak, rahmatullah alayhi, one of the great Imams of early Islam, said this knowledge is isnad is from the deen. If there were no isnad, people will say what they want whenever they want to whoever they want, is in one narration. So we need to make sure that we are upon a well-trodden path of scholarship, that we're not inventing something new, that our basic practices and basic beliefs and spiritual practices go back to an established practice of the great imams of this tradition. Beware of speaking about an issue for which you have no imam, is Imam Ahmad's famous words. Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullah alayhi, I didn't use Ibn Taymiyyah's quotes, but Ibn Taymiyyah's quotes are saying there's nothing wrong with the ilm ul-kalām if it's used in a positive way, in the way that we've been discussing.
Yes.
He says that it's in my Salafism book, so people can one day read it very soon. But he says what makes it difficult is if you start using innovative terms with obscure meanings, or it can mean this or that, and then you leave it free for the reader to decide, then that could skewer the matter. But if the innovative term that you're using is clearly understood and it can only mean this, or everyone knows it can only mean this, then you're using it. He said Imam Ahmad was not averse to innovative kalam terms. What he was averse to was innovative kalam terms which obscures the clear meanings of the book and the sunnah.
That's a very good point. Jazakallah for that, Shaykh. Very, very good.
And he has a lot of that. And Ibn Taymiyyah himself is criticized by the Atharis of his time, rightly or wrongly, of excessive indulgence in ilm ul-kalām, to the point where it caused him to err and blunder disastrously in some issues.
Well, yeah, so if
that's another debate.
Yeah, of course. If one reads, I think it's the Aqidah
Asfahaniyah.
Yeah, that's a very kind of deep philosophical kalami book, So yeah, absolutely. Anyway, Shaykh, so let's end on two things. Al-Ghazali, let's wrap up the Al-Ghazali statement. May Allah have mercy on him, in terms of his, he was a master of kalam, but he basically said that it should be only used as a medicine. And if you use medicine to someone who's not sick, you might make them sick, right? So Bismillah.
Okay, I'm just going to read them, and I'm not going to comment on them because they're just so nice and I think self-evident. Okay, so this is all from Ihya Ulumuddin, the first volume. Okay, so you can always whatever. So al-Ghazali, volume 1, page 354 of the Dar al-Minhaj print. In it there is ilm ul-kalām. In it there is benefit and harm. As for its benefit, in those situations where it is beneficial, it is ruled lawful, recommended, or obligatory according to the circumstance. As for its harm, it is forbidden whenever or for whomever it is harmful. Its harms are that it creates doubts and unsettles beliefs that then no longer rest upon certitude and firm conviction. This is something which happens at the outset, and there is no guarantee that he will ever win it back through rational proofs, for it differs from person to person. This then is its harms to sound belief. You start introducing ilm ul-kalām to the lay people or to the masses, even students of knowledge, from the outset, okay, whatever, especially if you get into it, okay, and you just, their minds explode, and there's shaitan's always there to get his victory, okay. That's al-Ghazali. Again, another one. It has another harm, namely, it hardens the beliefs of the innovators in their bid'ah and strengthens their bid'ah in their heart, in that it riles them up and increases their resolve to persist in it. Such harm, however, arises from bigotry born of argumentation. It is why you see the ordinary, unlearned innovator quickly dissuaded from his belief through gentleness, unless he has been raised in a place where argumentation and zealotry are rife, in which case, if all of mankind, from the first to the last, united to remove it from his heart, they wouldn't be able to do so. For desire, zealotry, and contempt for his rivals or opponents so grip his heart and thus blind him to the truth. ... Such is the fatal disease that plagues cities and peoples, the sort of corruption caused by partisan disputation. This is also its harm. Elsewhere he says in the same volume, as for its benefits, it might be expected that it is to uncover truths and know them as they truly are. If only that were so. Kalam theology is simply not able to fulfill this noble aim. This is al-Ghazali. Okay, honestly, if I didn't know this was al-Ghazali, I'd think, look, who is saying this stuff? Kalam theology is simply not able to fulfill this noble aim, and it probably confuses and misguides more than it reveals or teaches. If you had heard this from a hadith scholar or a hashawi literalist, don't worry about what that is, you might have thought people are an enemy to what they don't understand. So instead, hear it from one highly versed in kalam, who left it after mastery of it, who plunged its depths as far as any theologian can, who then went on to immerse himself in other sciences closely related to kalam before realizing that the path to the realities of knowing Allah, haqa'iq al-ma'rifah, was barred from this angle. By my life, Kalam theology is not void of revealing, defining, or clarifying some issues, but it does so rarely and about matters that are already clear or that could probably be grasped without delving into the art of Kalam at all. Last passage, and it's towards the end of his discussion. Rather, it has one single benefit: to guard the common man's creed, which we just outlined before, and protect it by way of argument from the misgivings of the innovators, which is really the definition of Sunni Kalam, guarding the creed of Ahl Sunnah from doubts and misguidances of the innovators who are trying to rationalize it away. For the common man is weak and can be easily unsettled by an innovator's argument, even if corrupt. Yet a corrupt thing may be refuted with something less corrupt. But people are only responsible for holding to the creed we have outlined. He just outlines a basic we believe type of creed. But people are only responsible for holding to the creed we have outlined. The sacred law enjoins it because of how it benefits them in their religious and worldly lives, and the pious Salaf were agreed upon it. The ulama are required to protect this creed for the public from the confusions of the innovators, just as a ruler is required to protect their property from the attacks of invaders or thieves. Now that its benefits and harms have been enumerated, one must be like a skilled doctor in how one uses dangerous medicine. One only prescribes it when required, at the time required, and in the amount required.
Nothing else needs to be said after that, I think. So, Sheikh, finally, I know we said we'll be only an hour. Now we're almost coming close to 2 hours. Alhamdulillah.
Oh no,
So
please don't say that. Inna
it's
lillahi wa
1 hour,
inna ilaihi raji'un.
46 minutes or so. So, Sheikh, when people, I started formal philosophy, secular academic training in, I think, 2014. So, and I just finished my PhD and submitted my minor corrections. So it's been around 12 years in academia. So I did a PG cert, I did a MA, I did an MRes, and I did a PhD. Alhamdulillah. Now, people have been asking me, I want to study philosophy, or I want to be like you, I want to do this, I want to do that. And I usually say to them the following. So I just want you to basically scholastically affirm or reject or enhance or give me a theological slap, whatever you want to do, Sheikh. I'll submit to your expertise and your authority. So basically, I say to them the default position for anyone, the default, aslan, is not to go to study Western philosophy. That's the default position, unless there are 5 things in place. And I say to them, number one, you have to have a kind of sound understanding of the Islamic worldview or the Islamic aqidah. Number two, you have to be following certain key fara'id, all of the fara'id actually, the obligatory actions like praying 5 times a day. Yeah. Number three, you have to have a kind of path to get closer to Allah, whether it's doing the athkar, the remembrances of God in the morning and the evening, the supplications in the morning and the evening, remembrance of God and sadaqah and so on and so forth. You need to be on a path like that because you need to strengthen the spiritual heart, because a shubha, a destructive doubt, or shubuhat, destructive doubts, are like parasites that want to drain your iman from your heart. You need to keep your heart strong. Fourth, you need to have good environment. You are the product of like the people around you. Yeah. 5, you have to have access to mainstream scholars who understand how to apply Islam in a contemporary sense, like applied aqidah, because you're going to have questions, concerns, and things happening that you won't be able to answer. So that's 5. Actually, the sixth one is You have to have a noble Allah-centric reason. You can't be doing it just because you think, I don't know, I'm going to be like this, French existentialist thinker sitting in a Parisian coffee shop having a croissant and cappuccino and writing in-depth thoughts. No, these are matters that can really affect your iman. So I'm just going to repeat those 6 criteria I said to people. Number 1, sound understanding of aqidah to a certain extent. You're doing the fara'id, the obligatory actions. You're having a path that a spiritual path, you want to use out those terms, according to the Qur'an and the Sunnah, that strengthen the spiritual heart, because intellectual shubahat are actually parasites that want to drain your iman, your faith. Number 4, you have to have good people around you because you're the product of your peers. Yeah. Number 5, you have to have access to mainstream scholars who have an understanding of applied aqidah. Yeah, because you're going to be addressing things in philosophy that is contemporary, and the scholars should be able to get access to Quran and the Sunnah and the classical knowledge and apply in a contemporary sense. And 6th point, which is a very important one, you have to have a Allah-centric reason, meaning it's either for da'wah or you're filling a gap or there's something important they need to do. The reason I came up with these criteria is because from my own experience, because I delved in kind of amateur philosophy before I got into academia, and alhamdulillah, I got into academia relatively late at the age around 33 or 34, and I realized if I went into academia 10 years prior, I would have been finished. Yeah, and so alhamdulillah, that experience itself allowed me to produce those criteria. I don't know if the sound or if the something of worth. And this is specifically studying Western philosophy.
Okay, so let's be clear at the outset. I'm not qualified to give fatwa. So this is not what I'm going to do here, fatwa.
Yeah, sure. It's advice.
Yeah, or deliberations with you to think it through. It is clear from every scholar, and Muslims kind of generally would know it if they even thought about it for a short time, that the first obligation upon an individual is make sure, once he or she has iman, let's just say they're born Muslim or they've converted, that iman and that practice that follows on from the beliefs, let's call it iman as a whole, needs to be safeguarded, needs to be preserved, it needs to be deepened and strengthened. It cannot be purposely open to doubts. We cannot just to be black and white, that's sinful. And forget about how foolish it is. It's just sinful. It earns the ghadab of Allah, the anger of Allah, that a person would knowingly and intentionally put their iman in danger. Because iman is what we owe Allah, and it is through this that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu, through His fadl, His grace, gives us salvation. And we want to be bartering with that or toying with that, only an idiot, okay, and one who's deserving of the worst outcome, okay, would do this. If that is agreed upon, and it is, then the next question to ask is, why would I want to study contemporary Western philosophy with all of its various disciplines and subjects and sub-subjects and ways of theorizing and intellectualizing and philosophizing? Well, if you're studying it after being very grounded, not, oh, you know what, I heard Tahawiyah read in a year in my local masjid after Asr. That's not being grounded, that's just being acquainted. Okay. But if someone is very grounded in their aqidah, and that's a fardul kifaya that we have to have in every community or every society, individual Muslims that are grounded in their creed, and they have then been given permission by their teachers in that groundedness, and they wish to specialize in learning Western philosophy in order to give an Islamic response, given that Western philosophy has been, along with scientism and the natural sciences, or scientism and naturalism, being the biggest tool and weapon to use against religion. And of course, naturalism and scientism are philosophical ideas and concepts anyway. Then this will be a jihad in the path of Allah, a fulfillment of a much needed fardul kifaya, and the ummah needs this desperately, and we don't have enough people to do it. It is one of the great acts of nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the ummah needs. Someone who, in a Ghazalian, Taymiyan type of way, said, I'm looking at the philosophies of my time that are attacking Islam and Tawheed, and I'm going to learn it in order to safeguard the ummah and rebut the misguidance of the misguidance out there. Then this is one of the great paths to drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in one sense, it's for that person who has the necessary skill set, it would be more worthy than praying 10, 20, 30 nawafil rakats on your prayer mat. Okay. For those who are not grounded in their aqidah, and they don't really have the permission, not only will they likely harm their faith, they will do more harm than good to the general Muslims, because half-baked knowledge on the long run tends to lead to more harm than good. Half-baked knowledge on the long run tends to lead to more harm than good. Not only to the individual, but to the society, because such people tend not to keep quiet. Okay, scholars are such that they might sit upon a mas'ala for 10 years and think about it, may discuss it with few other scholars and one or two really expert students, but it doesn't reach the light of day because it's still a scone in the oven, or a scone in the oven, whatever language you want to use, that needs to be cooked and baked thoroughly, okay, before it comes out to be consumed. And if enough people start doing that without great aqidah, they go into these areas, not only do they harm themselves and the ummah, they begin to normalize a deviancy, and they'll be held accountable on that for that. Every atom's worth of good and bad is accountable for. And the sunnahs that we set in motion, good or bad, and I mean sunnahs in a very generic sense, the practices that we set in motion, good or bad, we're accountable for. And to normalize something that should not be normal, okay, we're held accountable, okay. But there is and has been for a very long time a dire need, a vacuum indeed, in fact, of those people who are strongly conversant with Western philosophies, especially as it applies to faith, religious faith and practice, and reconstructing new worldviews or nihilistic worldviews that oppose traditional ways of being and living. Those who know those philosophies and ideas really well, that they should really, for the sake of Allah, learn their aqidah really well and try to see if they can write responses at various levels. Sometimes just pamphlet booklets, sometimes really well-established discourses. And I think not enough effort has been put in that direction. We're still lagging behind. There's a lot of good happening in places like Turkey and a few other places, but we're still lagging behind. And maybe we needed this time to prepare, but we need something out there. And I'm of the personal opinion, it's a personal opinion, better to lag behind and be really grounded before you come out than to come out half-heartedly or half-baked and do something for the sake of, I need to just repel the evil. No, inshallah ta'ala, hopefully there's more blessing that way, but that's just a personal opinion, okay, rather than a fatwa or anything like that. The 6 safeguards that you put are good safeguards for an individual who has solid creed, and a good understanding of the Western philosophical tradition or traditions, then those are really good to have. In fact, they're essential. Al-Ghazali, when he would learn ilm ul-kalām from al-Juwayni in the morning, would then go to, I can't remember if his name was Raza Khani or Rada Khani, one of his teachers who taught him Suluk and Tasawwuf in the afternoon, and he would have the circles would be in the Shaykh's garden, okay, Baghdadi garden, because kind of Ghazali got it that I've just done this really very dry discursive ilm ul-kalām in the morning with al-Juwayni, the foremost mutakallim of his age, Sunni mutakallim of his age, and now the heart needs to just be softened to its Lord, otherwise it's going to dry out pretty quickly. Let me also make, just for the sake of completion, in English, I think a good, acceptable translation, not the translation, a translation is when rational proofs are used to support revelation, we might call them discursive proofs. When they are used to subdue revelation, we might call them speculative proofs. So Mutazlites did speculative theology in that rationality trumped everything else. Sunni theologians, by definition, do discursive theology in that they do kalam that will support an already existing axiomatic point of aqidah or creed that is established already in the book or the sunnah or the ijma. I think that's a healthy way. Otherwise, we're using speculative, philosophical, and this, and kind of we're blurring the distinctions of what's going on, or even what is right or wrong. And Allah knows best.
May Allah bless you, Shaykh. Jazakallah khair. This was a learning experience for me as well, because although your hanbalism book is coming out maybe in 6 months or so, we went through a few chapters and one of them was on this topic. But I think this session was more comprehensive than the topic that we went through. May Allah bless you. Jazakallah khair for your time and your efforts. And I think this beyond debate series is going to be quite profound. This is the second one. Alhamdulillah. We'll do many, many more together, inshallah. And hopefully face-to-face, not just online. But Jazakallah khair for your time. You spent over 2 hours with us, 2 hours, 2 minutes, and around 4 seconds and counting. I think it was very informative.
Shall we end with a one small short dua? I think I need it, and I think this majlis, this gathering, online gathering, we could all do with it. Inshallah, just simple dua. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidil Mursaleen wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma habib ilayna al-iman wa zayyinhu fi qulubina wa karih ilayna al-kufra wal-fusuq wal-isyan. Jalna min ar-rashidin wa jalna min ar-rashidin. Oh Allah, make faith beloved to us and beautify it in our hearts and save us from sins and transgression and disobedience, and cause us to be amongst the righteous. That's really our prayer. Otherwise, ilm ul-kalām and all this stuff, it's just about connecting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about being clear upon the basic creed, the generic Sunni creed for the majority of Muslims, and really just following in the footsteps of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the inspirational examples of our Salaf in how to be in tahqiq al-ubudiyya, in realizing Allah's oneness and divinity in worship. And we ask Allah for forgiveness.
Ameen. Ameen. Jazakallah khair, Shaykh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.